Hello everyone, my name is KelSounds, and today I want to look more into the modulators section. I've been reading more of the kilohertz documentation, and I came across the triggering section. So it says, many of the modulation modules have a trigger button. The trigger button can be used to trigger a modulator and restart its cycle. And so of course the traditional way inside how modulation is happening inside of Faceplant is, once you have like your MIDI keyboard or some MIDI laid out into your DAW, the modulation inside of the LFO is triggered by the incoming MIDI notes. And so as you can see, every time I hit a note, the modulation restarts. But let's say instead of having the traditional way of doing things where incoming MIDI notes would trigger an LFO or whatever modulation type you have set, let's say I want to use another LFO to trigger the modulation of your modulator. Oh gosh, a lot of modulation stuff being said all at once. So to do that, I would just click on the plus icon of the LFO and hit the equal sign where the trigger input is at. And depending how I have my settings set here, this first LFO will then be triggered by my second LFO, which is going to be the modulator. And so yeah, I just thought this was really interesting and decided to mess around with it a little bit more and dig deeper into it and see how it could be used for music production or sound design. Personally, I like it for sound design because you can get a lot of crazy results with it. And it's just really cool and fun to do in general inside of Faceplant. Okay, so how this works. So it's actually pretty nice. I'm going to go ahead and open a new Faceplant here, hit analog, and then I'm going to grab a filter. And then for our modulators, I'm actually going to add a new group first and call this Modulation. These groups are just to help me understand what group's doing what. And then I'm going to rename the second group Trigger Modulation. And so inside of our first group, I'm going to add an LFO. Inside of our Trigger Mod group, I'm going to add another LFO. And then for our first LFO, I'm actually going to turn the modulation off and leave the second LFO modulation on. And so now in order to do this, we just hit the plus icon as we were doing earlier. And then we come over here to the modulation LFO where the trigger input is at and hit the equal sign. And now as you can see, it's being triggered by our trigger mod LFO. And so when you right click this trigger mod, you can see different settings here. You can see the LFO, the threshold, and the modulation happening. And so I'm going to go back to the kilohertz docs here for a moment. And so it says right clicking on a modulation trigger button will bring up the trigger menu where you can adjust the trigger sensitivity for when the trigger is modulated. And so I'm going to come back over here to Faceplant and right click the trigger input. And so depending on where we have the threshold set, which is this little line here. Once the modulation goes past this threshold, it's going to trigger this modulation. Actually, I'm going to right click this middle part here. Oh, I can't do it over here. Oh, it's right here on the bottom. So I'm going to come over here to the threshold, right click that, hit 0, so it's in the middle. So if we come over here to the LFO and adjust the sensitivity to below the threshold, as you can see, nothing's happening in our modulation group LFO. But if we lower the threshold a little bit, modulation is happening. And of course, you can adjust the threshold to whatever value you want. I just like to have it set at 0, and then you can adjust the sensitivity as I said before. It doesn't really matter where you have the threshold set, but in order for the modulation to happen in our modulation group, you have to make sure that, in our case, our trigger mod, which is an LFO, is going past the threshold in order to trigger the modulation. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and draw in a MIDI note here. Actually, I'm just going to drag and drop from the first one. And I have it playing right now. So I'm going to go ahead and modulate the cutoff. And there's no modulation happening. That's because our LFO isn't going past the threshold. So I'm going to adjust the sensitivity. And I also adjusted the threshold here. And now there's modulation happening. Now let's see what happens when we do this. I adjusted the rate of our first LFO. And let's see. Let's just mess around here with the rates. So the modulation happening to the cutoff is actually going pretty fast. But let's say I want the cutoff to keep playing as it's above the threshold here. So in order for that to happen, I'm going to go ahead and actually turn this to sustain. And so now, as you can see, once the modulation is held above the threshold, it keeps playing the filter. And it sounds like this. And as it goes below the threshold, it stops playing the cutoff modulation. Which is pretty fun. It's kind of cool to mess with. I'm going to turn it to free. All right, let's add another different kind of shape here. Let's see what's inside complex. Ooh, bit forming looks pretty interesting. Huh, pretty cool. And so yeah, I think I want to add my own shape here. So I'm going to come over here to the trigger mod. And I don't know, do something like this. Oh, I also enabled the magnet tool so it sticks to the grid. And I'm going to come over here to our modulation, maybe turn it to synchronization. And I think I'm going to adjust the cutoff here. Huh, interesting. And so yeah, that's how you modulate the trigger input with another modulator. And of course, I encourage you guys to go ahead and mess around with this and see what you get, just because it's really fun to do, just to kind of see what kind of sounds you can get out of this. And of course, not just with a simple filter. There's a bunch of possibilities with this. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Adios.